Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's wellness webinar, Stress and Aging. Today's webinar is being co-sponsored by Friends Life Care and Friends in the City. Friends in the City is also known as FITCI, and our presenter today just happens to be a FITCI member as well as a professor, and she's going to give us all kind of information. Dr. Cecilie Baker Goodrich Baker. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope you're all doing well and staying healthy and finding lots of people to talk to during these kind of somewhat lonely times occasionally. My name is Gail Tamarchio. I'm the Friends Life Care Director of Wellness Initiatives, and I'll also be your moderator for today's session. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few things that you need to know just in order to participate today. So this is an example of the attendee interface, and you should see something that looks like this on your screen in the upper right corner. And then if you would like to listen in on the telephone, like right now you're automatically listening in on your computer system or your phone or your iPad. But if you'd like to listen in over the phone, you just click the phone button and you will be able to see the audio information, which I believe is already in the attendee interface for you. If you're having any trouble hearing, if it seems like my voice is too faint, please check your speaker settings on your computer and see if that works. Okay, and Dr. Goodrich is going to take questions today, but please know that she's going to answer them all at the end. Her presentation is very, very thorough. She's covering a lot of information, and she may just answer your question before the end of the webinar. But you can type your question into the chat box at any time, and she will address them all at the end of the webinar, even if it runs over a little bit, which we really, really appreciate her doing. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, and her name is Dr. Cecilie Goodrich Baker, and she is magically appearing. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. After completing a BS degree in zoology at the University of Michigan, Dr. Goodrich finished her academic training with a PhD in physiology at Harvard University. And as a professor of biology at Cleveland State University and at Drexel University, she's taught courses ranging from freshman non-major courses to a wide variety of courses for biology majors and graduate students. She's been teaching biology of stress since 2013. And I think this topic is extremely timely because I don't know anyone that's not under some kind of stress right now at any time, especially right now. So Dr. Goodrich, thank you so much for joining us today. We're just so happy to have you and look forward to hearing what you have to say. And I'm going to change the screen now so you can get to your slides. Apologize, I didn't do that before. Okay, so here you go. And I'll see you at the end of the webinar. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail.
Thank
you. Oops, let's see. I want to tell it to, there we go. Yeah, one more thing to click. That's it, I think. Well, okay, now we're good. So here we are at the beginning in a peaceful situation, and I'll be using zebras on and off as a contrast for what happens with us humans. Zebras, of course, are prey animals, and so they don't just graze over the veldt out here. There are plenty of predators that will chase after them, and so therefore they have to exist in a situation of being prepared for strenuous exertion at almost any time. Today I'm going to be talking about 4 general topics. First of all, we'll have an introduction to concepts regarding stress, and then similarly we'll talk about basic information about aging, and then I'll put these particular features together and we'll talk about a combination of stress and aging. And finally, we'll talk about some general information on coping with stress and aging. I'm going to be talking about a number of concepts in terms of regulation, because this often offers a way of making a remedy for something that's happening, as well as a logical mechanism to explain an effect. And this should actually make a number of the definitions and concepts more logical, as I hope you will see as we go along. So we'll start out talking about temperature regulation, which is familiar to all of us. A thermostat obviously has a set point, and this is the desired temperature that you dial into the thermostat. A good air conditioning system can cope with whatever is going on an ongoing basis, and therefore if a lot of hot, moist air gets into the room and the temperature goes above the set point, then the air conditioning system will provide more cooling. And it can therefore keep the temperature approximately constant. It does this by responding in an opposite direction. So if the system changes to heat up, then the air conditioning system causes cooling down. This works in many systems in the body, and they maintain their own steady conditions automatically. However, as we will see when I go on, special conditions can change a set point, and so they are not absolute all the time. Next, I'm going to turn to Cecilie, who was the originator of a lot of the basic concepts that we're going to be talking about, although he did stand on the shoulders, so to speak, of important predecessors in physiology. When he was starting out as a young investigator, he observed 3 effects in rats that he injected with an extract of a hormone, which was new. Nobody knew what it might do. And after injecting his animals, he discovered 3 effects. One was they all got gastric ulcers, pretty severe. Second was that the adrenal glands increased in size. They became puffed up and large. And the third was that the immune system, in particular the thymus, shrank and got very small. So he said, hooray, I've got an effect, and maybe I better have some control animals. So he got another bunch of rats, injected these with saline solution, and he got the same results. Gastric ulcers, big increases in the size of the adrenal gland, and a shrunken thymus. Most people at this point would have said, hey, this is no good. I've got the same effects in my control animals and in my hormone injected animals, so it can't be just the hormone that's doing this. But the thing that was special about Cecilie was that he realized that he had a new phenomenon. So he set out to try more kinds of stressors. In the winter, he put rats on the roof, so they were subjected to cold stress. He kept them in the boiler room next to the furnace, so they were subjected to heat stress. He forced them to exercise, and he found that all these different stressors caused the same set of responses: gastric ulcers, huge adrenal glands, and shrunken thymus glands. So the reason he is important is that he realized that what was common here was his rough handling of the animals. He wasn't very good at the beginning in handling rats, and they do struggle, and they do bite, and they do escape from time to time and have to be chased around the room. So instead, he said he had a new phenomenon, that various stressors all led to a particular set of responses, these 3 responses, but that specific stressors, such as exercise or heat stress, produced responses that were not specific to those stresses. So exercise caused the same effects as heat stress. And the last thing that he noted was that stressors can cause illness. Those were fairly serious gastric ulcers if you were a rat. So now let's go back on this basis and talk about a new definition of stress, which will be more global. We can say that stress is anything that changes a set point of regulation, and that's surprising. So I'll have to prove it from time to time as we go along. I can't give you all the proof here in a nutshell, but I'll be giving you examples that will give you a hint. First of all, let's talk about common types of stress. some stressors are said to be short-term and physical. In other words, we have something that happens for minutes, and we are very good at responding to these. We are good at escaping from lions ourselves if we have to. So those are short-term physical stressors. Long-term physical would be minutes to maybe hours. And again, we're pretty good at that. We can withstand a marathon if we've trained for it. On the other hand, there are some kinds of stressors that are said to be psychosocial. These are stressors that cause changes in emotions or mood. They may be short-term, they may be long-term, and unfortunately, we are not as good at responding to those. In fact, the responses in all too many situations may be counterproductive. Another thing to note is that there may be anticipation of stress. So when you just think about going to the dentist, unless he's a particular friend, that can be psychosocial stress of a special kind. Next question is, what happens when we respond to stresses? What are the general patterns or hallmarks of stress responses? One thing that happens is that there's an infusion of nutrient into the circulation. So various types of nutrients come out of storage in various places, and it's like getting a quick infusion of food or something like that. And at the same time, there's inhibition of nutrient storage. So now there's plenty of nutrient around to fuel active muscle exertion. And at the same time, there's stimulation of the cardiovascular system so it can pump the nutrient around. The respiratory system works harder, and so we can get more oxygen. And because the cardiovascular system is working, that all is carried to the working muscles. Another thing that happens at the same time, we're not necessarily aware of because we don't consciously realize when we are digesting food, unless we have a particularly noisy digestive system or some other special feature, but we're not aware of growth as growth goes on. And these housekeeping kinds of functions like digestion and growth can use quite a lot of energy. So that is inhibited. And at the same time, many kinds of immune defenses are inhibited. What's the use of that? Well, this is a major consumer of energy, although again, we're not conscious of it, and therefore it's not obvious that that's happening. What other kinds of stress responses go on? There's something that happens through the nervous system that's called stress analgesia, and this means there is decreased perception of pain. That's handy if you're a soldier in combat and you've been seriously wounded, and you may not feel pain. In fact, even be aware that that's happening. This is an extreme situation, obviously, but somebody can call your attention to it and you'll say, oh, wow. Another thing that happens in the central nervous system is that there are short-term shifts in various other functions, such as sharpening of attention or improved short-term memory. This is obviously useful and can be even life-saving in a physical emergency. How long do these stress responses last? Well, the quick answer is it varies. There are some kinds of responses that can be said to be immediate. They last seconds to minutes. And these are typically mediated through a portion, a special division of the nervous system that's called the sympathetic nervous system, and also adrenaline from the adrenal medulla mediates these short, quick responses. Intermediate stress responses can last for hours, and for these, there is a significant amount of cortisol that's secreted from the adrenal cortex, and depending upon the situation and the individual, this may also be supported by some more activity in the sympathetic nervous system and more adrenaline secretion. If there is a longer, more intense kind of stress, then there can be chronic stress. And this can last for hours to days. And most of these adjustments take place through increasing cortisol. And many of these responses can be termed as adaptive. That's a scientific term meaning good in biological terms. But in the chronic phase, this is when stress-related diseases can begin to appear. And these include alterations of metabolism that can be counterproductive, changes in cardiovascular function. In other words, all of the things that I've listed already can work against an individual. Another one that's a bit surprising is decreased bone density. And I mention that because Olympic athletes who are training very intensely submit themselves to intense stress also. And our friend up here, cortisol, our usual friend, can cause decreased bone density. And so occasionally when an intense athlete of this professional type has an unexpected bone break, that's because cortisol makes their bones more brittle. And another effect that happens chronically can be some degree of memory loss. So again, a lot of the responses to stresses are termed good or beneficial or adaptive. But why do we have these stress responses? Well, it's because many of the responses are useful. But responses to psychosocial stress are often bad. In other words, they're not useful in biological terms. And one of the ways of understanding this would be to say that since little or no exercise occurs, although cortisol and all of those other changes occur, then there's no way to use up the extra nutrient and all of the other things that have happened due to the stress responses. So that's how eventually psychosocial stress can have bad or deleterious effects. And this is a reminder to me to say, what are the general effects of exercise? In general terms, these effects of exercise are preparation for intense exercise. And if you have other questions as we go along, I'll be glad to answer those. Now let's turn to some features of aging. One way of describing aging in very general terms would be to say that there's a progressive loss of the ability to deal with stress. And that's another kind of surprise, but it works fairly well, unfortunately. So let's take a look at aging. First of all, it's a good idea to think about this. How normal is the process of aging? We all know that if you compare the physical status from 20-year-olds to 70-year-olds, on the average, the older people are less fit, are less healthy, less capable. Now, is this a normal process? Or should we think of this as a series of malfunctions of some sort? And the way you answer this question is very important because it defines how you should think about what a doctor could do for you. Doctor, I'm malfunctioning. Or not, this is happening and I have to get along with it in some fashion. Are the so-called diseases of aging due to complications in the aging process, or should we ask them to be fixed in some way? But it's not all bad news. There's some good news. There's a huge amount of variation within populations of older people. And here's a graph that I cooked up to sort of indicate this. If you give people a simple multiple choice test, I'm not seeing my pointer. I'll have to get that back. There it is. Over on the right here, you see with a young population, they might have an average of 20 correct answers in this simple word test, but there's a lot of variation. Some people don't do as well. Some people do better than 20, average is 20. An interesting thing that is often seen is that in an elderly population, they can have the same average as a younger population, but there's this huge amount of variation. Some people do terribly and other people do terribly well. So this variability is something that we will keep an eye on throughout as we go along. Now let's turn our attention to functional changes in aging. There is degeneration in some systems, such as the skin. The skin gets thinner. It doesn't function as well in protecting us, and therefore it's easier to break the skin and so forth. Some systems have a general functional decline, and I'll come back to this point in a couple of minutes. Other systems show decreased responses to various types of stressors. So they are okay as long as there's no stress, but then the responses to stressors is not as effective as it was previously. There are also characteristic so-called diseases of aging, among which are arteriosclerosis and cancer. Certain types of cancers happen to older people more often than to younger people, and senility. But again, the onset and the severity can vary individually. So some people start earlier and it gets more severe. Other people have very slow changes that only begin to affect them later on, and they're not as intense. Let's talk about declining function with age in more detail. One of the things that happens is that metabolic rate gradually decreases. How much? After the age of 30, metabolic rate on the average goes down about 5% every 10 years. So by age 50, the metabolic rate is 10% less than it probably was at age 30. And unless somebody adjusts their diet, there is increased fat storage, a decrease in lean body mass, and there's an increased potential for type 2 diabetes. So you can't just eat the same diet and expect to be the same in the same healthful condition as you were at age 30. Kidney function generally decreases. What does that mean? Well, it means in general terms that there is a decreased ability to form a concentrated urine. And we need to do that when we need to save water. We don't want to lose water. We want to have more excretion of end products without as much water loss. So with this decrease in function, there's more water loss and more loss of sodium and chloride. And that can become serious. Also, the cardiovascular system has a decreased maximum performance. The lungs lose their elasticity and function less effectively. So both of these systems are not functioning as well as they were in someone, let's say, 30 years old. The gastrointestinal system slows down, constipation becomes a more common problem, and there's what's scientifically called the reproductive climacteric in both females and males. There really is no male menopause. It should be called a climacteric. Now let's take a quick look at altered regulation with age. Altered in many cases means impaired. So if we take a look at thermal regulation, temperature regulation, this is for both cold stress and heat stress, and it can become very serious. Let me give you a more lengthy example of what happens this time of year during a real week of heat stress and high average humidity. Whereas a younger person would be able to perspire a lot and therefore regulate their body temperature, older people can't regulate as effectively and therefore they begin to heat up. Their internal core temperature gets hotter and hotter, and that can become serious. In a human environment, whereas a younger person will perspire a lot, there's not as much cooling and less perspiration often in elderly people. And so without as much cooling, again, body temperature goes up. And with all of this water loss through perspiration, along with having an elevated internal temperature, this can all lead to heat stroke. So the obvious remedy for heat stroke is, number one, to get the person cooled down as fast as possible, get them into a cool environment, pack them in ice if necessary, replace the water that has been lost as sweat, and if necessary, replace any salt that was lost. So temperature regulation needs to be watched carefully and can become lethal both for cold stress and heat stress. Many hormone systems decrease their responsiveness if things change. And by this, I'm talking about the thyroid gland and a variety of other glands. There's also a general increase in the numbers of autoimmune diseases that are seen. And in order to give you some sense of what that's about, I need to talk about the immune system in a little more detail, because as you will see, stress responses are still going to cause an increase in cortisol. So why is it that there are more autoimmune diseases with increasing age? The immune system has very special regulation, and military analogies work pretty well in talking about the immune system. There are a set of cells that are resident around the periphery of the body, and these specialize in rapid deployment. In other words, these special cells sit under the skin, in the lungs, in the lining of the gut, and they are specialized to attack foreign material, including infectious agents. They're there all the time, but they are not specialized to attack particular kinds of diseases. So they're just a general border patrol, if you like. There are also large concentrations of immune cells in special organs, such as lymph nodes or the thymus glands, and these are analogous to military bases in my analogy. Another thing that's special that the immune system can do is that it can have a memory. It can undergo rapid mobilization to any insult that's repeated. So if you have survived mumps or the measles, you will have a long immunity to those particular diseases. The immunity or the memory varies. It's about a year, give or take a bit, for the so-called seasonal influenza, and it's relatively short for the common cold. So let's take a look at what's so special about the regulation of the immune system. Instead of regulating to come back to the same starting point, in the immune system, there are steps in which a change in the system causes a response that goes in the same direction. And a regulatory response, therefore, reinforces the initial change. And combined, these produce large, rapid changes in function. And I'll give you an example to show you how this could work. Imagine for a moment a chemical reaction that produces heat rapidly. And if this heat accelerates the chemical reaction, more chemical reaction will produce more heat, which accelerates the chemical reaction, which produces more heat, and so forth, until there's literally an explosion. So this is the kind of large, rapid change that's produced by this special kind of regulation. There's no set point, in contrast to the other kinds of regulation. In this regulation, the response is in the same direction as a change. And in order to keep things under control, it requires more complex regulation that is sometimes redundant. Several things may combine to regulate effects in the immune system. Otherwise, we would all be suffering from autoimmune disease a lot of the time. So here's our special case of regulation. Oops, sorry. Now let's turn our attention to cortisol and aging. In people as they are aging, the resting levels of cortisol gradually increase in many individuals. And this means that there is an increased risk for type 2 diabetes, one of the effects of cortisol all by itself. And there are altered immune functions. In other words, our responses to infections are not as brisk and effective. This suggests that there must be a regulatory change in the amount of cortisol that's circulating in the system. And that's peculiar, but this is still the best explanation that we have. It's as though our own regulation becomes less sensitive to our own cortisol, which allows the cortisol to increase and increase gradually. Or another way to express this would be to say that the set point for cortisol regulation has been increased, and therefore it's not unregulated, but it's regulated around a higher set point. Let's finally take a look at the changing causes of death to put some other things in perspective. Humans have their best function around 30 years of age. This is when you're best if you want to try to run a marathon, although since there's so much variability with aging, it's possible to run a marathon later. But the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system are functioning optimally, and so forth. Historically, there have been major effects on population in the world due to infectious diseases. And here, beginning at 1000 in the Christian era, is the increase in European population, a decent estimate of it. But in the late 14th century, the Black Death hit Europe, and this decrease from 85 million people down to 60 million people is equivalent to approximately 1/3 of the population. As soon as most people got over the Black Death, then the population began to increase again at a steeper rate. But in the 17th century, the bubonic plague hit Europe. This time, the effect was not as severe. Only about 10% of the population died. But I'd like to call attention to the length of time each one of these lasted. The Black Death lasted about 68 years, give or take, down here. And the bubonic plague lasted for about 25 years, give or take. So I'd also like to have you take a look at Dr. Schnabel, we can call him, or Dr. Snoot here. He's a German cartoon, but this is the way medieval physicians dressed. You'll see that he's totally covered from head to toe. He's even wearing peculiar gloves. He has a mask with glass eye windows here so he can see out. He has this peculiar snout, which is packed with camphor and a variety of herbs that smelled good, because they thought that the plague was being caused by what they called miasmas, in other words, bad smells. I don't know whether he survived or not, but this is reminiscent for us right now. And finally, I'd like to take a quick look at the known causes of death in one subdivision of London from August 15th to August 22nd in 1665. You don't die of a broken leg, but this person was thought to have died from a cough, and that could be an infectious disease, so I marked it with a star. All of the things that are starred here are likely to be infectious diseases. I'll come back to the box around frightened and suddenly a little bit later on. Childbed fever was a common cause of death in women who had just given birth. Other fevers, likely infectious diseases. Griping in the guts, again, infectious diseases. convulsions, that could be meningitis. Teeth, you don't think of poor teeth as causing 108 people, 18 people to die, but if the teeth are badly infected, this could cause septicemia, and so it's an infectious disease. Consumption is tuberculosis, spotted fever, another infectious disease, and finally plague in that neighborhood killed 4,237 people, only 27 survived. So in historic terms, people often did not live much beyond about 30 years old, although there were always senior people around who at that time deserved to be venerated more. And it was only in the last 200 years that wars have killed lots and lots of people. And here are some data quickly from our own American wars. Particularly, well, the Civil War sticks out because it was so horrendous on both sides. And during the 20th century, we have not so much effect during the World War I, but the United States entered that war late in comparison with Europe. We entered a bit earlier in the Second World War and therefore had many more casualties and also fought in many more areas. Pearl Harbor I just put in for comparison to see one serious event. The Korean War was estimated to have killed about 55,000. Vietnam at the time killed about 50,000. And it's interesting to note that the sum of all of these 20th century wars is about 627,000 people. We have recently exceeded 127,000 people who have been killed by our COVID epidemic in the United States. So by the end of the 20th century, we thought that we had generally found enough antibiotics to cure infectious disease, and we weren't paying as much attention to public health. Our causes of death were more often things like arteriosclerosis, cardiovascular disease causing high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, strokes. Another cause is cancer. Again, there are typical cancers found more often in old age. Pneumonia still kills a lot of people when they are older, an infectious disease. But accidents kill a lot of people. People fall off of a ladder or fall down, trip, and so forth. So accidents are recent causes of death, and we're not finished with all of those effects yet. So to sum up, there are some kinds of good news. There's a lot of variability in the onset and the duration of aging. Aging in general mimics chronic stress. Because regulation is less effective, it means that we are more susceptible to various kinds of stresses, and cortisol remains the main agent that is found in stress effects. Now let's take a look at what stress does in the elderly. Elderly, aged individuals respond to stressors by increasing their total amounts of adrenaline and cortisol, just as younger people do. But in this case, the responses are less effective. There's an increase in adrenaline, but in particular, the cardiovascular responses are not always useful. The heart rate can go way up, yes, but if somebody has advanced atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, this can even cause sudden death. And this is obviously hard to study because people are not around studying people just before they clutch their chest and fall down. But during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Scud missiles were fired at Tel Aviv, and more people died suddenly, probably due to heart attacks, than were killed by the explosions of the Scud missiles. Similarly, in 1994, the big earthquake in Los Angeles killed more people through sudden heart attacks than were trapped in the wreckage and crushed. So sudden death is something to be concerned about, and these could be the causes of deaths due to fright or suddenly in that listing of causes of death that I showed you. So we have decreased responses to cortisol, even though the adrenaline still causes responses, but they're not always useful. The changes due to cortisol are prolonged in older people. And in order to illustrate these, I'm going to I'm going to show you first, the duration of these responses. Here is a gentle stress test that can be done by sticking your hand into ice water. And if you keep it in there for enough minutes, your body temperature will go down a little bit. It can go down by 1 degree Fahrenheit, which is enough. If young people take their hand out of the ice water at that point, they get back to normal rather quickly. Elderly people go down about the same amount in the same length of time, but when they snatch their hand out of the cold water, it takes a long time to return the temperature to normal. Or here's a different kind of example. If you have young people and older people who are both taking a simple word test, an IQ test, you have them chugging along, both doing about the same as I showed you in that other example I showed you. If suddenly you say, okay, now you've got to hurry because you've only got 2 minutes to finish up, everybody begins to do worse. The young people fall off rather quickly. They start making mistakes and their accuracy, their total score falls. It happens to older people too, but the stress has a bigger effect in older people. So stressors have different patterns in older people. If you define a population of so-called healthy elder people, this can be done by saying these are people who have no sign of heart disease. They have no sign of getting infections more often. They're the right weight and so forth. These apparently healthy older people have a slow increase in cortisol that mimics mild chronic stress in a younger person. Added stress in a person like this can cause more increase in cortisol and therefore still produce stress effects. So they have a slight increase in cortisol. Stress can cause more increases and they can show more stress effects. But for this, I'm going to give you this strange example of something called Cushing's syndrome. And this is a disease that involves big increases, significant increases in cortisol in the circulation over long periods of time. It may be weeks to months to years, depending on the situation. What causes this? Well, it can be due to a tumor that either directly or indirectly produces lots of cortisol, or it may be due to chronic medical administration in order to deal with rheumatoid arthritis or other severe autoimmune conditions. So why am I talking about Cushing's syndrome? Well, I'm using this as an extreme model to show what may happen in elderly people with prolonged increases in cortisol. And these are things that we have evidence for in Cushing's patients. They have high blood pressure, and this is probably an indirect effect of cortisol. They have often type 2 diabetes, and I've marked that with a C because it's possible to trace that to a cortisol effect. They have abdominal obesity, but weak limbs, arms and legs, again, likely to be a cortisol effect. Brittle bones, as I mentioned earlier, cortisol effect. Immune suppression, cortisol effect. Memory problems, cortisol effect. And depression, another cortisol effect. So a lot of bad news if we are all likely to get any or all of these effects, but there is some good news. And that is that even among 80-year-olds or maybe even 90-year-olds, there's a subpopulation that have younger levels, in other words, lower levels of cortisol and less intense stress responses. It's not known exactly why this happens. What characteristics do these people have? What are they doing that we might want to imitate? Well, some of the effects here are probably genetic. And so if you didn't win the genetic lottery, what could you consider doing? Well, these are people who exercise regularly, and they often have expert guidance. They used to go to a gym. Maybe they have a trainer, or maybe they have a routine that they were helped to set up so that they have regular exercise. People who are angry, who are driven, and we can call type A people, these people can benefit by psychotherapy. It will help them to cool down and actually can decrease their levels of cortisol. People who practice nerve-wracking situations. You may think, well, what in heaven's name is that? How many people here remember when you were first learning to drive in traffic? Can you raise your hands? Well, that's nerve-wracking, but as you practiced, you probably got less stressed by the whole situation. And we can make use of this if we find a situation that is annoying, seriously annoying, or nerve-wracking. We can practice in that situation. There are many aspects of aging that are depressing. Somebody has said, this is not for sissies. So what can we do to avoid depression? Well, one of the most useful things is to find social support. People who have a generous number of people that they can talk to, that they can chat with, that they are friends with. These are people who can actually decrease their cortisol by increasing their number of social friends. It's possible to find ways to control aspects of the situation. So if you're proactive when you see something happen, and you begin to respond quickly, that gives you a sense that you're not out of control as badly, and you can feel better about it and less depressed. You could learn to predict events before they happen. So if you know it's coming, you might take some sort of action to predict them before they can engulf you. On the other hand, if prediction this can make a situation more frustrating, because if you dislike it and then you predict it and then it happens anyway, it can just be more frustrating and more depressing. So that's a two-edged sword. Another thing to do is to find outlets for frustration. Develop a hobby. Find something that gives you pleasure and do that. So to summarize, many people in our culture are exposed to psychosocial stress. This is stress that causes bad emotions, that causes depression. And they have relatively little exercise stress. So the changes that are occurring are the changes that are seen in younger individuals through chronic psychosocial stress. Some of these changes of aging mimic chronic stress in young people, but elders have responses that are less effective due to higher levels of cortisol and prolonged before the stress responses return to normal again. Again, changes in regulation of cortisol. So let me summarize again and say that I don't want to just talk about the bad things that happen due to aging and stress, but let's take a look at some things that we might be able to do proactively. How do you cope? Well, again, there's good news and there's bad news. It's possible to reduce stress responses in older people. As I've already mentioned, it's possible to reduce the amount of cortisol and the extra cortisol that's reduced in response to stress. But the bad news is that this usually requires long-term changes in lifestyle. And these are the hardest things to do. How many people here have tried to stop smoking? That's a profound change in lifestyle and very, very hard to do. So how can you combat this? What should you try to do in changing your lifestyle? Increase exercise. Again, get good guidance on what you're doing and how much you do it. What is the optimal diet, and what should your best daily routine be? How can you actively introduce coping strategies? And therefore, how can you minimize anger? Or how can you learn to meditate or activate other kinds of skills for calming? There's no single simple recipe for doing this. And the reason for that is that a combination of approaches may work better or worse for some people, or because stressors differ, physical versus social, or short-term versus long-term, a combination of approaches is more likely to help. Is there a good side for stress? Again, after all these bad things that stress can do to us, why do we have stress still? And one analogy is that it makes a good analogy to pain. Pain helps to protect us from further harm. You snatch your hand away from the hot stove. Pain alerts you, it focuses your attention, and pain can lead to learning. Stress can activate alerting pathways in the brain. It can produce interest, excitement, and motivation, unless it's too extreme or too strenuous. And it can enhance memory. So we now have what you could call excitement junkies who go bungee jumping whenever they have enough money, or cliff diving, or jumping out of airplanes. But it doesn't have to be this crazy. Have you ever watched children on the lawn in the summer? They stick their arms out to the side and spin around as fast as they can, giggling hysterically as they go. It's pleasant. So a little bit of stress can be pleasurable. The right amount of stress can help us do things. Too much stress activates the bad parts of the response. So we need stress responses, especially for exercise, but we need to recover appropriately from the adrenaline and the cortisol before too long. We need to be able to shut them down, literally, in a reasonable length of time. Even intense type A people can learn to improve and reduce their stress responses. But on the average, people who have lower cortisol chronically do better. So I'm giving you a couple of references in case you'd like to read and want to follow this further. This book by Sapolsky is written for the general public. It's a good read. My students have always liked it and given it rave reviews. And Jon Kabat-Zinn is one of the gurus of meditation techniques. And you don't have to read the whole big book. You can flip to a chapter on how to deal with pain or how to deal with depression. It's called Full Catastrophe Living because it harkens back to Zorba the Greek, who said he had family, children, the full catastrophe. And now here we are looking off into the sunset with our zebras dealing with the effects. They're not stressed anymore because they've learned to cope. And I will stop here and take questions for a while. Thank you very much.
Dr. Goodrich, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating presentation. I learned so much, and it's wonderful to know that we can, even though they're difficult to do, it's nice to know that we can make long-term lifestyle changes to make a difference. And the Full Catastrophe Living, I've read that book, and I think it even comes with a CD or an MP3 where you can actually do the meditations with it too. So I agree with you 100%, and I want to check out why zebras don't get ulcers.
Before we go on, I'm fully meant to tell you why zebras don't get ulcers. And it's in my notes, and I shouldn't leave it the subject. Zebras don't get ulcers, as you may have concluded, because their stresses are mainly physical stresses and maybe not very long physical stresses. They don't have many psychosocial stresses, which are the things that cause you ulcers and all of those other effects.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I find the pictures to be very calming too. I'm just looking at the zebra, so it's very calming. So thank you very, very much. And you did such a thorough job. This is the first webinar we haven't had any questions. I think you did such a great job presenting everything. That's amazing. So we'll give like another second or two to see if anybody has any, but that was just so complete. And I could listen to you talk all day. It's really, really very interesting. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave, you're going to get a quick 5-question survey. It's just like, just choose one answer. And you can write a short answer too. And we'd really appreciate it if you just take a few seconds just to fill that out, because we love your feedback. And I'd like to give it to Dr. Goodrich. And also just so we know, what you're looking for in webinars.
Please.
And what to help you to get more out of our webinars. You're also going to receive a follow-up email within 4 hours, and it'll have a link to view a recording of the webinar. And so you can view it again, or you can feel free to share it with your friends. It also will be posted on our website and on our Friends Life Care YouTube channel. So lots of different opportunities to see it. And our next, that you're going in the follow-up email, you'll get information about our next wellness webinar. It's called Your Money or Your Money and Your Mind, about how our beliefs and how our thoughts about money affect the way that we use money. And it's going to be presented by a certified financial planner. And he's going to talk also about some new acts that we need to know about to do thorough financial planning. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And that's going to be on Tuesday, August 18th from 11 a.m. to noon. And like I said, that'll be in the follow-up email. And also in the email, we have one other thing coming up. Starting next Tuesday, we're going to be doing 15-minute mindfulness meditations, which is perfect after full catastrophe living, and John Cabot's in. So we're going to be doing these 15-minute mindfulness meditations on Tuesdays from 10 to 10:15 a.m. And there'll be a link if you'd like to join those. Those will be live. And we're going to do those on Zoom. So they say there's power to meditating in a group. So we're going to meditate, we'll be able to see each other. If you want to turn your camera off, you can definitely turn it off. You don't have to have it on. But they say there is power, the energy of a group. So we thought that would be a really nice thing to do, to do that. So thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at future wellness webinars. And Dr. Goodrich, thank you very, very much. Oh, I have a question. A question that somebody just popped up here. So let me see. Oh my gosh, a lot of questions. So, okay. All right. So let me just ask this. Okay. So someone said, thank you for the clarity of your presentation. And they say, somebody said, clearly all of those stress reducers are more available to educated, affluent, well-balanced individuals and less available to uneducated, poor, traumatized persons. Yeah. So privilege could be shorthand for stress reduction. So that's an interesting point.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And does a stress test measure cortisol?
No, it measures what your heart rate is as you pedal furiously. And if you a target that's based on your age, then you're said to have passed that. But some people cannot do that, and they have to do it under conditions that are safe in case it might introduce or induce some bad effects on the heart.
Right, interesting. Here's an interesting question I'm sure a lot of people are interested in. How does sleep or lack thereof affect one's stress levels and cortisol levels?
Actually, sleep interacts with cortisol in complicated ways. People who run high cortisol may have more trouble sleeping, may have nightmares, may find it difficult to get to sleep or wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it works together with depression. So less sleep makes you feel bad, literally, and can enhance depression. And solving the depression can, in turn, cause better sleep.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Everything's all holistic. It's all tied together.
That's right. The head bone is connected to the neck bone.
Right. Absolutely. So someone had a question. Their grandson is not being vaccinated by the daughter-in-law, and she's wondering if that bodes badly for his future health.
Yes, it could, depending, well, it's obviously important for him
Mm-hmm.
because some of these diseases can be very serious. And if a very, very young baby is not immunized against measles and some diphtheria, whooping cough, they can be fatal. So there can be fatalities, but it also is bad for all the rest of us because suddenly there can be a epidemic spread of measles, and that happened, what was it, a few years ago in Disneyland.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important. We have good evidence that vaccines are mainly good, that there are rare bad reactions to vaccines, and that there is a lot of misinformation about bad reactions to vaccines. So I would be personally concerned.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. A lot of people have questions about that. So somebody had a question about the handouts. They said they weren't able to access them off the interface. There's a link to the handouts in the email that you received an hour before the presentation that had the link to this to sign on to the presentation. So if you just go back to that email that you received an hour before, it'll be in there. So we just have a few more questions. So how does inflammation enter into the picture?
Inflammation. Inflammation is an indication of a response of the immune system. And therefore, in people who have reduced immune responses because they're older and they have higher levels of cortisol, that
Mm-hmm.
means that an infection can become fairly serious before the little immune reaction, the inflammation, can take place. So
Mm-hmm.
an inflammation just means that the immune system is reacting.
Oh, okay. No, very
So it's
interesting.
redness, pain, swelling. These are the so-called cardinal signs of inflammation.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I know there's a lot of news about inflammation and about
Mhm.
how it is for our bodies. So do you recommend a person from a certain age get a DEXA scan for the bone loss?
That's a tricky issue. There are several indicators. One is, does it run in your family? If you have relatives, particularly male relatives, who had very
Mhm.
serious brittle bones and broken bones, then you should talk to your doctor about that.
Right.
The bad news is that it's too late to take more calcium to make your bones more strong. That you should have done when you were 20 years old. So
Mm-hmm.
maintaining calcium intake is important earlier on. But again, talk to your doctor because there are different indications. On the other hand, some people react better than others to the drugs to increase bone density.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you should consult with a doctor.
Mm-hmm. And we have a program on our website too from a physical therapist who
Mhm.
has about bone health, and she actually has some exercises on there, and she's actually doing live classes now too, Joanne Fagerson. But she was able to turn her osteoporosis around with exercises to strengthen without medication. So there
Right.
is hope out there. So look on our website for the bone
Mhm.
health.
Right.
Actually, that's not on there. We're going to be sending that out again. I'm sorry, that was
Mhm.
not on the website, but we'll be sending that out again. And somebody has a question about whether there's a reason that you didn't talk about fight or flight.
Oh, fight or flight is just means strenuous exercise.
Okay.
So whether you're fighting or whether you're running, strenuous exercise is involved.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And then somebody had a question about what's the difference between the Black Death and the bubonic plague? They thought they were the same.
Actually, they probably were, but they were locally given different names.
Okay.
They
Interesting.
probably were both bubonic plague.
Right. Okay. Excellent. And then I have one. Somebody says, thanks. Fascinating presentation. Never realized that I'm already getting more and more like a zebra without really thinking about it. So I guess that's and so nothing was said about ACE, the adverse childhood events. The study
I'm sorry,
about
nothing was said about what?
the ACE study, the adverse childhood events study,
Oh,
do you know about
okay.
that?
Mhm.
And so wild animals are able to expend all of the trauma energy, whereas humans are often socialized to hold on to it, which is interesting. But you
Right.
kind of know that zebras do have the physical stress, but they don't have the psychosocial stress that
Well,
humans.
Actually, it's a little more complicated. There are clever experiments in which graduate students went into a rat colony every day, picked up the little rats one by one and handled them, and then put them back in the nest.
Mhm.
And those rats, when they got old 4 years later, had lower levels of the rat version of cortisol
Interesting.
than the others. And then, of course, well, if a little bit of stress, kindly stress, if you like,
Mhm.
is good for rats, then what's going on? Because if you just measure older rats, they are in this case like humans. We're not always like rats.
Mhm.
They, the mother rat picks up the baby, carries them around, licks them, handles them, and puts them down frequently. That's what a good mother rat does. But sometimes the mother rat doesn't handle baby rat as much, and that
Mhm.
rat will grow up to have a higher level of its equivalent of cortisol.
Interesting.
So a little bit of, well, we need to be handled as babies, clearly,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
orphanages certainly have showed us that the wrong kind of stress in childhood is very deleterious.
Right. Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. Fascinating research. So how can we deal with subconscious stress? Like somebody said, I don't feel stressed at night. I constantly grind my teeth and clench my jaw.
Mhm.
And I know that's because stress is there. Besides meditating at night, is there anything else that you'd recommend?
Yeah. What does that person like? What's fun? Now, probably it's not a good idea to watch television because
Mhm.
we now know that the blue parts of television and the computer screen are not so
Mhm.
good for us. So reading, knitting can be very calming. Other kinds of handwork. My husband, before his death, used to build ship models, and any sort of hobby is
Mhm.
calming because it focuses your attention rather than leaving your mind to jump from topic to topic to topic.
Mhm. Oh, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, because it's like she's absolutely right. The subconscious stress can really get to you, and it does seem to show up at night.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely. Mhm.
we want to do everything we can to mitigate that. Now, someone says if older, this is our last question, if older people react less to a virus because they have, weakened immune system response, how is it they end up with a cytokine storm?
We still don't know the entire answer to that, but I
Okay.
mentioned that there are cells of the immune system that live in the lungs. And these cells appear to be able to communicate with the rest of the immune system. So
Mhm.
if an alarm goes off, so to speak, a lot of the cells in the lungs say, whoa, we've got a horrible invasion going on. That might be able to trigger the cytokine storm. This is a fictitious excuse that I've cooked up on the spot. We simply don't know enough.
Right. Very interesting. So much to learn, right? As much as we know, there's always more to learn. So, and that is all the questions. Those were wonderful questions. And, I said a wonderful presentation. Dr. Goodrich, really appreciate that. And again, thanks to Fitzy for bringing Dr. Goodrich to us. And visit our website, friendslifecare.org, for more of our wellness webinars and to see this one. And like I said, you will receive a recording within 4 hours. So thank you very much. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.